You're listening to Boomers Today with your host, Frank Sampson.
Well, welcome to Boomers Today. I'm your host, Frank Sampson. Of course, each week we bring you important and very useful information on issues facing baby boomers, their parents, and other loved ones. And I can't thank everybody enough for all their support. I need to mention this each and every week that many who listen to our show on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, many online stations. So, you have then listened to those shows and forwarded them on to friends and family, and that's how our show has grown with listeners, and I can't thank you enough. And I know you're doing that because we have wonderful guests, and we have another wonderful guest today. Her name is Aviva Black, and she's the founder of Family Love Letters. As her family was going through their father's papers a few days after he passed away, her and her siblings found a sealed letter he left for them in the top drawer of his desk. His letter became the inspiration for Family Love Letters, and we're going to learn more from Aviva on that. Aviva continues to enjoy her role as a mother, coordinator of her temple's Intergenerational Connect program, and as the daughter of a rabbi. Aviva, thank you so much for joining us on Boomers Today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me to be on your show, Frank.
Yeah, it's a great story. Maybe you could expound upon that, how you kind of got started with Family Love Letters.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, my father, he died about 9 years ago. But I'll tell you, before that, for all of his life, he was an incredible conversationalist. He would regale people around the dinner table, and he would be inspiring from the pulpit as a rabbi. And as a father, he was there for us. He was giving us wisdom on a daily basis, but he was also an incredible listener. And then as he became sick, he lost his ability to really track conversation. So here's someone who connected through conversation, and he really lost that ability to have deep dialogue. And then he got sick, and not soon after, years after, he died. And we found this letter in the top drawer of his desk, and we're completely surprised. We had no idea that he had written us this letter, but when I took the pages out and I was holding the pages that he held and that he signed, we laughed and we cried. It was really him. And every word was truly wrapped in love. He spoke about his upbringing. He spoke about his experiences and all the influences in his life. But he also talked about what his hopes were for us, both to be citizens in the world and also to be there for one another and for my mother. So I felt this very deeply, as did my siblings, and it was a real connection with him, and one that I was, definitely going to pass on to my kids. So every time I need some grounding or I want to hear his voice, I take out this letter and I read it in full or just parts of it. So soon after my father died, I was talking to lots of other people about letters or other things that they had from their parents or grandparents. And I found that some people had things from, great uncles, a letter that had been passed down, but most people did not have anything written from a parent.
Right.
So I set about starting this business to help people communicate in an enduring way with their children. And what's fascinating is that while my father left this letter for me, I would say 98% of my clients actually give the letter to their children right away. They're so excited. about, first of all, about what they've put together, but also they're so excited to talk about the stories that have been captured. So it's
Right.
really a conversation starter.
All right. So do you tell me how you work with the families. Do you assist in the writing? Do you just guide the individual who is putting together that letter for their loved ones? How does it work?
Yeah, so I try to make it as easy and enjoyable for my clients as possible. So the way it works is we set up 3 1-hour conversations. We meet by phone, and all the client has to do is get on the call. And from there, we have a guided conversation. So I ask questions. I have specific prompts, but of course, there's an organic flow to the conversation. And we talk, and I take all of the content from those conversations and I create a cohesive letter that is in the person's words and the person's voice, so that when the reader is holding that letter in their hands, they are hearing their loved one's voice. There's that
Gotcha.
connection. I'm invisible, except that I do the work, all the copy editing behind the scenes
So when
to
you
pull
when
it
you
together.
say hearing, are you actually sharing the the recording, or you're talking they're kind of reading the words and they can tell it's their loved one's own words, or both?
Yeah, thank you. That's an important distinction. So it's not a recording. In
Okay.
fact, I don't share the recordings because people are answering questions off the cuff, and they need to be
Yeah.
able to process and feel comfortable that way.
Got it.
So what the reader is hearing are are the words that they're reading. It's an actual typed letter
Gotcha.
that they're
Gotcha. No,
reading.
that's
So
great. Yeah, because
yeah,
I'm sure
yeah.
there's a lot of people that go, I want to write something, but I'm not a great writer. And, they talk through it with you. I think it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And, Frank, ironically, even the great writers, I mean, my father was a great writer and he was disciplined, right?
Yeah.
So, but it can be really hard, even for good writers, to sit down and get through the letter from beginning to end because,
Mhm.
we tend to wordsmith or never think that it's complete, that it's finished and ready to give.
So I'm curious when the final, I guess the final letter is completed, is it written in the individual's own writing? Is it typed? Is it what's the final version look like?
Yeah, so the final version is a typed letter, and they're usually between 8 and 16 or 17 pages typed. So you can
Wow.
imagine handwriting that would be pretty arduous.
Yeah, got it. Now I was curious because my parents are long past, and uh, I know that my wife and I have my mom's recipes, and those recipes are in her writing. And more important than the recipes is just seeing it in her writing is just very meaningful. Um, and so that's why I was wondering. I was wondering that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that is why the client, if they're able to sign the letters, the copies that are given to each of their
Right.
children,
Yeah.
yeah, so that they can see
Yeah.
that handwriting, that signature.
That's great. That's great. So
Mm.
uh, I'm going to ask this anyway, even though I kind of know the answer, but I want to ask it anyway and get your perspective. Aside from legacy, why is it so important to preserve these stories for future generations?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. There's so much interest now in both genetics and in family trees, right? We see people doing tons of research with 23andMe and Ancestry, for example. But when I ask people what they would like to know about their grandparents, if you could ask your grandparent something that you couldn't find online, what would it be? And it's those types of stories and those sentiments and the feelings and emotions behind the experiences that you really can't find online. I mean, even Henry Louis Gates has to fill in, the gaps, right? And he has all the resources, right at his disposal. But there's a connection through the generations. So it's not just legacy, it's about connection and about lasting connection. And there have been studies that show that when children know about their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, the thread in their line, when they know about the struggles that they, came through and the challenges and the successes, that they become themselves more resilient. So there's power in knowing your family stories. And of course, those stories are part of your own story. Yeah. Each generation builds on the one before it.
I get a little emotional even talking to you, because I wish I had that from my parents. I do. But so I think it's wonderful what you're doing, So give me some, maybe just a couple of examples of just the types of questions you would ask. People get a feel for it. You say you spend quite a bit of time talking, so I'm sure you ask a lot of questions. But maybe you could just give a few examples of the types of questions you ask.
Oh, sure. I mean, one question that we start off with in the first call is, what type of kid were you? It's always fun for even adult children to know what their parents were like as kids.
I bet you they're usually saying, I was a troublemaker, huh?
It's so true. I get rascal. Rascal is used a lot.
Oh, rascal, yeah. Probably because of the little rascals back then. Yeah.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I ask them to think about someone who has helped them in life. And quite often it would be a parent. And, other times it's a teacher who came to the house to deliver homework assignments when someone was sick for, a period of time, or a mentor at work. We also talk about, times I ask, what was a time or an experience that you had where you felt stronger or more courageous than you would have thought you would have been? Or we talk about forgiveness. How do they define forgiveness? When have they been given? And when do they forgive? Or questions around success. What does it mean to be successful? Right. And very rarely is it about work.
Yeah.
Right? It's really success in life.
That's great.
And what's amazing too. Oh, we also get into, in the last call, we talk about relationships. Whether it's how did you meet your spouse, what drew you together, and what has kept you together, or what are your hopes for each of your children. So we get into all sorts of stories. And what's really wonderful about this is not just the end product, but the experience for the person is writing this letter with me. He's having these conversations with me, because they'll think about things they hadn't thought about in a long time, or think about something in a new way. But in addition to that, in between the calls, the juices are flowing. And so things will come to mind. And when we hop on our next call, the person's so excited to tell me something that they had thought about and wanted to include in the letter.
Yeah. I'm sure this depends on each person and their time and your time and all that. But from the time you begin, they say, yes, I want to move forward, and you have that first phone call. Usually, how long does it take on average till the finished product is done?
Yeah. So it takes between 5 and 7 weeks.
Gotcha.
Calls, so the calls are typically 1 week apart, just to keep the momentum going. And then there's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes to pull it all together. I should mention that the last call is one of my favorite pieces of this great puzzle. On the last call, which is a fourth call, I read the letter aloud to the client.
Right.
And without fail, he or she is surprised by what they said. And here's a quote. "I know I said this, these are my words, but I really can't believe that this came out of my mouth and my mind and my heart."
Wow, that's great.
Great. So it's really moving. It's a really moving experience. And I do that just so the person can absorb, what they said.
So I want to ask this, mainly because as you know, we spoke, and the type of work that I do and my company does as it relates to senior care. And I wanted to ask this because you might be, talking or interviewing someone who maybe, might have a little dementia going on. They could be at that age. So have you had experience with that, and how's that worked?
Yeah, so I've worked with clients who have moderate cognitive impairment or decline.
Right.
And what I say to all of my clients, first of all, is if you don't remember details, specific numbers, or, street names, it really doesn't matter. First of all, I'm not going to be fact checking. But in addition to that, the letter is about themes. And it's to paint a picture rather than give, a specific chronology. So I really believe that whatever can be captured is wonderful.
Right.
And because someone has dementia doesn't mean that we don't do anything.
Well, no, I guess that's the point I wanted, hopefully you to make, is that those that are listening and have, well, God, I'd love to have my mom or dad, do this, and but maybe they have some dementia. But the thing about dementia, we don't have to get all the details, that long-term memory is usually pretty good. It's the short term. So they may not know what they did, last week or yesterday, but they might remember the specifics of their childhood. So, anyway, we don't have to get into those details, but I think it's a good point. So we're going to take a real quick break, I promise, just to recognize our sponsor. And we come back, I'd love for you to share, if you will, maybe some examples of families that you've worked with. All right, not the names, but maybe tell us some examples. All right.
Sounds good.
Okay, great. So my question to all of you is, do you know anybody who may be concerned about an older driver? Well, Senior Care Authority's Beyond Driving with Dignity program is a facilitated self-assessment program for older drivers. This program has been designed to serve as a vital tool to facilitate older drivers and their families as they make appropriate decisions regarding the future of one's safe driving career. If the individual is a safe driver, an advisor will provide him or her with strategies on how to remain a safe driver as they progress through the aging process. If driving retirement is the appropriate decision, then the individual and their family are offered possible alternatives, resources, and a specific plan to ensure a smooth and successful transition from the driver's seat to the passenger seat. To learn more, go to www.beyonddrivingwithdignity.com, or you could call 877-907-8841 to connect with a Senior Care Authority advisor in your area. We're back with Aviva Black, who's the founder of Family Love Letters. I just love this concept, Aviva, what you've done. So maybe you could just give us some examples of, before we do, I apologize. I'm going to take a step back here. People are probably going, well, God, how do I get a hold of Aviva? So maybe go ahead, and it's commercial time. Go ahead and share whatever information you would like.
Oh, thank you. So you can go to my website just to get an introduction to Family Love Letters, and the address is www.familyloveletters, that's with an S on the end, .com. And there's a contact page, so you can feel free to reach out to me through the form on the contact page, or you can email me directly at Aviva, that's A, V as in Victor, I, V as in Victor, A, at familyloveletters.com. And you can even call me at 415-336-3125. And I will get back to you if I don't pick up, or if you email me, I will certainly get back to you within 24 to 48 hours.
All right. And, because I would think
and from all of you.
Yeah. So I would also think that it doesn't matter where people are located, right? I mean, you can do this with people anywhere, even outside the
Absolutely.
US, right? Okay.
That's
good.
right.
Good.
That's right. Because we do this by phone and or Zoom. If I've actually worked with people who need to read lips. So we also work by Zoom, but it can be anywhere, which we know now, right? Through COVID.
Yeah, exactly. So, share with us some, any examples you want of families that have come to you and that you'd like to share with our listeners.
Oh, sure. Well, I recently worked with a woman who is a child of Holocaust survivors. And she was very worried, really concerned that her letter would just be doom and gloom. And so she was reticent to even write a letter, and then needed to be assured that her letter was both accurate, right, and it was genuine, but that it wasn't completely gloomy. Well, sure enough, as the thread in her family life is one of hope. And that really shone through. And when I talked before about the concept of resilience, that we need to know what the struggles were. You can't just brush things under the rug, and certainly not the Holocaust, right? These things need to be out in the open. And so what I focus on with clients are the takeaways. And I say, don't shy away from discussing how being a child of a Holocaust survivor, which, is a very specific, has its own specific set of challenges when your parents were in the Holocaust and are survivors.
Right.
So we looked at the takeaways, and honestly, her letter was one of optimism, there was a brightness to the letter and great hope. And it was very real. And it sounded like her, which is, glass is half full,
Oh, that's wonderful.
So she's one example. Yeah. And it was really great.
Right.
And then I worked with a woman who I'd say she's probably now 62. And I worked with her several years ago. And after we finished her letter, she wanted me to work with her mother, who was at the beginning stages of Alzheimer's. And I worked with her mother, and it's a very different kind of letter than the daughter's, not only because her mother, started to have cognitive decline, but also because of her mother having the long view. She's just older and more experienced, and the 62-year-old who at the time was probably, 57 or so, she had children in her 20s. So it's a very different letter.
Right.
What we prioritize in our late 50s is different than what we prioritize in our 80s.
Sure.
But then subsequently, she gifted family love letters to her brother. So she would like to have multi-generations doing this sort of thing, capturing these stories and have them build upon one another. And, the way I describe it is when you see the family tree, you see the names and what years that they lived. But this is like turning over the leaf of the family tree. and really seeing what made that person tick. Who were they? How did they become the people that they were?
Right.
So,
Right.
so that's another example.
Yeah. So let me ask you, I'm not sure if this has happened. I would guess it maybe has, but what if a particular family member either has had in their feeling, they didn't have a very good past, and they really don't want to talk much about the past. How do you handle that situation? Has that ever happened?
Yeah, it happens. It happens quite often, Frank.
Yeah.
What I say, first of all, is, do you know anybody who hasn't had hardship in their life? I mean,
Right.
I don't, right?
No,
And
of course.
it is
Yeah,
true,
everybody has.
right?
Yeah. Right.
And it is true that some people had really rough childhoods. And so what I say to that person is, we don't need to necessarily go into every detail of what you experienced in that hardship, but what your takeaway is will be so informative to your children and your grandchildren and future generations, because they want to know how you got through it.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I always tell people that if I ask a question that doesn't resonate or you don't want to answer right now, you don't have to. This is your letter. It's not mine.
Right.
So, the client has final say as to what goes into the letter.
Yeah.
What does not go into the letter, this is where I draw the line, is guilt.
Yeah.
These are love letters, right? It's a family love letter. So I don't want anything to be misconstrued. So I make sure that we're really clear about what's being said, but I also don't want the readers to feel, to feel negative feelings from their parent or their loved one.
How do you make
it's really meant to be love?
Yeah. How do you make the decision of what to edit out, or are you including everything they're verbalizing to you?
Yeah. Well, no, I'm not including everything. I mean, as I mentioned before, when I ask a question, the client does not have any prep. They haven't done any preparation. They're not seeing the questions necessarily ahead of time.
Right.
And so I need to give them space to be able to process aloud. And so not everything will be included for that reason, but also, if there's something that would be left hanging. So, if someone alludes to a relative that may have done something that's negative, if I can't get more information and it just doesn't lead to anything, then we'll make the decision to edit that. So, I mean, again, like the letters, they vary. Like I said, there could be a 10-page differential between the shortest and the longest, but the longer one's not necessarily any deeper or, any more descriptive than the shorter one. It's just how the person tells the story.
Right.
So some people, they're more poetic, like truly, like maybe they're songwriters, and I that's actually an example. So they might tell it in a more fluid way, that could be in more florid way. So it could be longer than other people who, who have shorter letters.
Unfortunately, we're kind of out of time. I could talk to you all day about this. I think it's wonderful, but maybe you could just, leave our listeners with, just any input you have. Is there a good time to do this? Just or just anything that you want to share with our listeners.
Yeah. So what I would say is there is an urgency to doing this. My father wrote his letter, if you can believe it, 30 years before he died. And I'm so glad he did, because he never would have been able to do it in the last years of his life. So I would say, don't wait. Preserve your stories today. One story, many stories, either through me or, on a phone app, or just write down a story or a thought, but don't wait. And also to find a modality that's enjoyable for you. Let the experience be one that's easy and engaging for you and really joyful. So I'm on a mission to have everyone write this type of letter for their children and grandchildren.
That's a great mission. That's a great mission. So Aviva, thank you so much for joining us on Boomers today. Check it out, familyloveletters.com. And again, Aviva, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I want to thank everybody out there for joining us as well. Please be safe. Talk to you next week.
You've been listening to Boomers Today with Frank Sampson. To learn more about today's show, visit boomerstodayradio.com and join us next time for another edition of Boomers Today.